Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is November 30th. Can you believe it? That is crazy. November is already gone. You know, I thought what I would do is start a little countdown to the winter solstice. I just clicked on it. 21 days till the winter solstice. So December 21st. That's going to be an easy countdown. I'll do it anyway. But the winter solstice is also called the hibernal solstice, and it occurs when either of the Earth's poles reaches its maximum tilt away from the sun. Now, what that means for us here in the northern hemisphere is that this is the shortest day of the year. And then after the 21st of December, days will start to get longer. And that's great for gardeners, and that's also great for plants, because that infinitesimal change in daylight starts to accumulate. And that, in addition to the temperature, is what starts to trigger spring. So we're almost turning the corner, which is fantastic news. Well, this morning I had another Max morning. I shared a great little picture of Max, a happy little photo of him as we were doing our walk in the neighborhood park and in the woods. I always carry a little clipper with me, and then I have to carry the ball launcher for Max because he'll start barking when he's ready to play fetch. And so I was throwing the ball in all of the snow that we got. We got 6 inches of snow yesterday in Maple Grove. And today could not be more different from yesterday. Yesterday, it was dark. It snowed all day. And today, the sun is out. It's crisp. It's very cold. It's chilly out. But it is so fun to walk in the fresh snow. And I love when we get out into this clearing and Max can be the first living creature to put his little paw prints in the snow. It's fun to watch him trot out. And, you know, it makes it a little bit easier to help find the ball if he loses it, because all I have to do is look for the plop in the snow. And I can usually help him find it if he can't sniff it out for himself. And, you know, days like today are a great day to pay attention to your tree architecture. I was thinking about this as I was going through the woods and thinking about many of my ornamental trees. You know, when they're all leafed out and you're trying to prune them, sometimes you can miss obvious areas where you should be pruning because there's so much foliage. Or even in the early spring, like in February and March, when most Minnesota gardeners should be going out and doing some pruning on their trees. It's just so cold in those months. And so even though today is pretty cold, it's not as cold as what it's going to be in February and March if it's a traditional year. Then we're looking at negative temperatures and we're not there. So today's the perfect day to go out, not necessarily to prune, but to mark where should you be pruning. And for that, I just take a can of my oil rubbed bronze color spray paint, and I just lightly mark some of the branches that I want to take out. Now, I like to do that instead of using kind of that garish orange that the city likes to use when they're coming through and marking trees to take out in the neighborhood. But either way, it's a great idea to mark problematic branches. Either they're crossing or rubbing, or if it's just something that you don't like and you want to get it out of there. Plus, I think it really does help you maximize your pruning time in the spring or the summer or whenever you happen to be pruning. And it sure makes it a lot easier when you walk up to these specimens and you've already done some marking earlier in the year. So give that a thought. It's the perfect time to do it. All right. And then the other thing that I wanted to share with you is yesterday I was talking about VSS 365, which stands for Very Short Story, 365 days a year. And every day, if you participate in this, they give you a little prompt. And today's prompt was the word swan. And so that got me thinking about lesser celandine, because in Scottish folklore, they called that flower the yellow swan. garden. And so today, when I was writing my very short story, that was my inspiration, and that was my connection to the word of the day, which was swan. Now, another thing I did is I was looking for a good name for my character, and I was imagining a midwife or a healer going through the forest and seeing this lesser celandine in bloom. And so I just Googled famous midwives. And of course, Ina May Gaskin showed up. And so I named my main character Ina in her honor. So I'll share this little story with you, and then we'll get started with the rest of the show. So again, the word of the day is swan. If you want to write a story about a swan, you can share it in the Facebook group, or you can jump on Mastodon and share it there. Just make sure to use the hashtag VSS365 somewhere in your post. All right, here's my story. The lesser celandine was blooming. The Scots called the flower the yellow swan, probably because they bloomed when the whopper swans were migrating. As a floriographer, Ina knew those yellow blossoms had another meaning, and when she saw the celandine garland over the door, the message was clear: time to flit. The Scots also thought the flowers brought good luck because they looked like little gold coins, but Ina wasn't so sure. And there you go. Ta-da! That's the end of the story. Now that time to flit, that's the meaning of that flower in the language of flowers. Time to flit, time to move on, time to pick up your house and go. And of course, whenever I think of the word flit, I think of Sound of Music, fleetly flee, we fly, that kind of thing. But anyway, fun word today, swan. So I hope you get a chance to participate. And I hope to see you over on Mastodon. So think of that as well. Today in garden history, it was on this day, November 30th in 1791, that Martha Ballard recorded her work as an herbalist and midwife. And for 27 years, Martha kept a journal of her work as the town healer and midwife for Hallowell, Maine. In all, Martha assisted with 816 births. Today, Martha's marvelous journal gives us a glimpse into the plants that she regularly used and how she applied them medicinally. And as for how Martha sourced her plants, she raised them in her own garden or foraged for them in the wild. And so it was that 229 years ago on this day that Martha recorded her work when she was helping her own sick daughter. She wrote, "My daughter Hannah is very unwell this evening. I gave her some chamomile and camphor." Well, today we know that chamomile has a calming effect, and that camphor can help treat skin conditions and improve respiratory function, as well as relieve pain. So, very effective. And today we also celebrate the birthday of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, also known by his pen name, Mark Twain. He was an American writer and humorist, and he was born on this day, November 30th in 1835. Many people would be surprised to know that Mark Twain used the garden and garden imagery to convey his wit and satire. In 1874, his sister Susan and her husband built a shed for him to write in. They surprised him with it when he visited their farm in upstate New York. The garden shed was perfectly situated on a hilltop overlooking the Shamong River Valley. This shed was not only a spur for creativity, but it took Mark Twain out of the home, which was a good thing because he smoked as he wrote, and his sister hated his incessant pipe smoking. But it was in this little octagonal garden or writing shed that Mark Twain wrote significant sections of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He also wrote A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court there, The Prince and the Pauper, A Tramp Abroad, and many other short works as he looked out on the garden. In 1952, the octagonal Mark Twain garden shed was relocated to the Elmira College campus in Elmira, New York. Today, you can actually go and visit the garden shed with a student guide. They'll bring you there daily throughout the summer and by appointment in the off-season. But I thought what I would do to cap off this little celebration of Mark Twain is to pull together some of his garden-related writings and share them with you. Mark Twain wrote, "Climate is what we expect. Weather is what we get." And regarding the summer landscape, Mark Twain wrote, "It was a soft, reposeful summer landscape, as lovely as a dream, and as lonesome as Sunday." A little hearken back to the past when people observed the Sabbath and stayed home. They didn't mingle with other people, and so Sunday was often a lonely day. And finally, here's a little excerpt about some thoughts that Mark Twain had about Eve from the story of Adam and Eve, and I thought you'd get a kick out of this. He wrote, "To get the full value of joy, you must have someone to divide it with. After all these years, I see that I was mistaken about Eve in the beginning. For it is better to live outside the garden with her than inside it without her." Very sweet. And today we wish a happy heavenly birthday to the Canadian writer and the author of Anne of Green Gables, a Sagittarius, Lucy Maud Montgomery. She was born on this day, November 30th, in 1874. Lucy was born on Prince Edward Island, and she was almost 2 years old when her mother died. Like her character Anne of Green Gables, Lucy had an unconventional upbringing when her father left her to be raised by her grandparents. And despite being a Canadian literary icon and beloved worldwide, Lucy's personal life was marred by loneliness, death, and depression, and that often surprises people. But historians now believe that Lucy may have ended her own life. Yet we do know that flowers and gardening were a balm to her. She grew lettuce, peas, carrots, radish, and herbs in her kitchen garden, and she had a habit of going to the garden after finishing her writing and her chores about the house. Today in Norval, a place that Lucy lived in her adult life, you can go and visit the Lucy Maud Montgomery Sensory Garden. It's located right next to the public school, which is fantastic because, of course, that means that it's close for students to visit as well. The landscape architect Eileen Foley created the garden, which features a horizontal or analemmatic sundial. It also hosts a butterfly and bird garden, a children's vegetable garden, a log bridge, and a woodland trail. Sounds lovely. It was Lucy Maud Montgomery who wrote, "I love my garden, and I love working in it. To potter with green growing things, watching each day to see the dear new sprouts come up, is like taking a hand in creation. Just now, my garden is like faith, the substance of things hoped for." Great quote. That would be a really good quote for a garden sign if you're looking for one. A wonderful little quote for a garden walk. All right, and today we also celebrate Frank Meyer, the Dutch-American plant explorer. He was born on this day, November 30th, in 1875. Frank worked as an intrepid explorer for the USDA, and he traveled to Asia to find and collect new plant specimens. Frank was prolific. His work netted over 2,500 new plant specimens, including so many that we know and love today in our gardens, like the Korean lilac, asparagus, the Chinese horse chestnut, water chestnuts, oats, wild pears, the ginkgo, and persimmons, as well as soybeans, just to name a few. But today, Frank is remembered for a little bit of fruit that was named in his honor, the Meyer lemon, in honor of Frank Nicholas Meyer. Frank found it growing in the doorway of a family home in Peking in China. And that lemon that he brought home, that specimen, is suspected to be a hybrid of a standard lemon and a mandarin orange. Early on in his career, Frank was known as a rambler and also a bit of a loner, which in many ways made him perfectly suited to be a plant explorer. He wasn't leaving a family behind at home. Frank once confessed in a letter to a friend that he wrote on October 11th in 1901, "I am a pessimist by nature, and I have not found a road which leads to relaxation. I withdraw from humanity and try to find relaxation with plants." Sounds a little sad, doesn't it? Well, Frank was indeed more enthusiastic about plants than he was about his fellow human beings. He even named his plants, and he would talk to them. That must sound familiar to many gardeners. But I think Frank also suffered from anxiety. Once he arrived in China, he became overwhelmed by the abundance of the flora there. Now, Frank believed in reincarnation, and he once wrote to David Fairchild, his mentor, "One short life will never be long enough to find out all about this mighty land." He's talking about China. When I think about all these unexplored areas, I get fairly dazzled. I will have to roam about in my next life. Well, China was the jackpot for Frank. He made so many new plant discoveries there. But the risks and the hazards of plant exploration were also very, very real. And the writer Edward Clark spoke about the difficulties that Frank faced in a magazine called Technical World in July of 1911. He wrote, "Frank has frozen and melted alternately as the altitudes changed. He has encountered wild beasts and men nearly as wild. He has scaled glaciers and crossed chasms of dizzying depths. He has been the subject of the always alert suspicions of government officials and strange peoples who were jealous of intrusions into their land. But he has found what he was sent for." Well, we owe a debt of gratitude to Frank Meyer. He improved not only the diversity, but also the quality of American crops with his exceptional ability to source plants that would grow in the various growing regions of the United States. And Frank was known for his incredible stamina. Unlike many of his peers who were carried in sedan chairs, Frank walked on his own accord for tens of miles every single day. And his ability to walk long distances allowed him to access many of the most treacherous and inaccessible parts of interior Asia, including China, Korea, Manchuria, and even Russia. Frank died on a trip home to America. He had boarded a steamer and he was sailing down the Yangtze River. And if I recall correctly, I think he died within just a day or two of boarding that steamer. His body was found a few days later, floating in the river. To this day, his death remains a mystery. But his final letters home expressed loneliness, sadness, and exhaustion, which was, of course, to be expected. But in that last note, Frank wrote that his responsibilities seemed heavier and heavier. A good reminder to all of us that the life of a plant explorer was anything but easy. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Wood by John Lewis Stempel. This book came out in 2019, and the subtitle is The Life and Times of Cockshut Wood. John Lewis Stemple is a farmer and a countryside writer. He actually prefers that title to nature writer. So when the Times called him Britain's finest living nature writer, he would have rather been called the finest living countryside writer. John's books include the Sunday Times bestsellers The Running Hare and The Wood, and he's the only person to have won the Wainwright Prize for nature writing twice with Meadowland and Where the Poppies Blow. In 2016, he was the magazine columnist of the year for his column in Country Life. John lives in Herefordshire with his wife and 2 children, and today's book, The Wood, was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. The Wood is written in diary format, making the whole reading experience more intimate and lyrical. You really get to hear John's voice shine through on every page. John shares his take on all 4 seasons in the English woodlands, along with lots of wonderful nuggets culled from history and experience. And I might add that John is a kindred spirit in his love of both poetry and folklore. John spent 4 years managing Cockshut Wood. It's not very big, just 3.5 acres of mixed woodland, and John's job entailed pruning trees and raising livestock. Both pigs and cows roam free in the woods. John wrote of the peace and privacy that was afforded him by his time in the woods. He wrote, "Cockshut was a sanctuary for me, a place of ceaseless seasonal wonder. No one comes looking for you in the wood." In this book, John shares what it was like for him to manage the woods his final year. The publisher writes, "By then, John had come to know it from the bottom of its beech roots to the tip of its oaks, and to know all the animals that lived there, the fox, the pheasants, the wood mice, the tawny owl, and where the best bluebells grew. This is a wood you will never want to leave." The wood starts in December, making it the perfect holiday gift or winter gift. John writes about the bare trees and the gently falling snow. The landscape becomes still and silent. John writes, "I'm oddly aware, walking through the wood this afternoon, that it is dormant rather than dead." By January, the wood stirs back to life with the arrival of snowdrops. John writes, "If snowdrops are appearing, then the earth must be wakening. Of all our wildflowers, the white bells are the purest, the most ethereal, the most chaste. The snowdrop says that winter is not forever." Well, as the wood takes you through an entire year, the book ends as another winter approaches. The trees are again losing their leaves, animals are preparing for their long sleep, and John is preparing to leave the woods for his next chapter as well. Looking back, he writes, "I thought the trees and birds belonged to me, but now I realize that I belonged to them." This book is 304 pages of a joyful, poetic, and soul-stirring time in the woods, with the elegantly articulate John Lewis Stemple as your guide. And I like to say he's part forest sprite with a dash of delightful nature-soaked tidbits that he happily shares with us. You can get a copy of The Wood by John Lewis Stemple and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $6. And I have to tell you that I fell so in love with this book that I went back and I started ordering copies of all the other books that John has written. So someday I hope to complete my collection, and I'm well on my way. All right, we end the show today with a botanic spark that remembers the Crystal Palace in London. It was on this day, November 30th, in 1936, that the Crystal Palace in London was destroyed by fire. The spectacular blaze was seen from miles away, and the Crystal Palace was created by Joseph Paxton, the English gardener, architect, and member of Parliament. He designed the Crystal Palace, also known as the People's Palace, for the First World's Fair, the Great Exhibition of 1851. Joseph had built 4 elaborate glass greenhouses, and that provided valuable experience for him in creating the Crystal Palace. The Joseph Paxton biographer Kate Colquhoun wrote about the immensity of the palace in her book. She wrote, Paxton's design, initially doodled on a piece of blotting paper, was the architectural triumph of its time. 2,000 men worked for 8 months to complete it. It was 6 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral, enclosed 18 acres, and entertained 6 million visitors. The Crystal Palace was an extraordinary and revolutionary building. Joseph found extra inspiration for the palace in the natural architecture of the giant water lily. Instead of creating just a large empty warehouse for the exhibit, Joseph essentially built a massive greenhouse over the existing Hyde Park. And that high central arch of the palace, the grand barrel vault that you can see on all the old postcards and images of the Crystal Palace, accommodated full-sized trees that Joseph essentially just built around. Another innovative aspect of the Crystal Palace was the large, beautiful columns. Joseph designed them with a specific purpose: drainage. By all accounts, the Crystal Palace was an enormous success until the fire started on this day back in 1936, around 7 p.m. The manager of the palace, Sir Henry Buckland, had brought his little daughter with him, and she was ironically named Crystal. You can't make it up. So here's Crystal and her dad Henry, and they're making rounds on the building together when Henry spied a small fire on one end of the palace. Newspaper reports say that the fire spread quickly and that flames fanned wind through the pipes of the irreplaceable Handel organ as the palace burned to the ground. And so a very sorrowful song accompanied the end of an era in plant exhibition when the Crystal Palace burned almost 100 years ago today. Kind of a sad note to end on, but definitely a milestone in terms of greenhouse design and inspiration for modern-day conservatories. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Gardener. I always appreciate that. Don't forget to spend a little bit of time with your trees this month, especially if you're having a mild winter. It's a great time to grab that spray can and mark the branches that you want to prune in February or March. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. Hi there, and oh, there goes that stupid dinger. Why? I have to shut this stuff off. Okay, why? Okay, now I'm getting notifications left and right. One moment. Mute. There. Aha. All you have to do, I did not know this. If you have a tab open in Chrome, you click on the tab and then you can right click and select mute site. So right now I have Facebook open and I have Mastodon open, and they both ding and let me know when somebody is trying to get a hold of me or they send a message or something. So anyway, well, that's a nice little thing to know. So now I can record in peace. Okay, here we go. I'll do it anyway. But the winter solstice is also called the hibernal solstice. Hibernation. I'm going to just look this up. One moment. Hibernal. Am I saying that right?
Hibernal.
Yeah, hibernal solstice. Okay, here we go. But the winter solstice is also called the hibernal solstice. This is such a rough start today. Okay, here we go. But the winter solstice is also called the hibernal solstice. And today's prompt was the word sun. Not sun, you silly. A swan. Okay, let's try it again. And Huckleberry Finn. He also wrote A Connecticut Yankee and King's Arthur. He also wrote A Connecticut Created the Garden. It features an analemmatic. Created the Garden, which features an analemmatic or horizontal. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book. Okay, we're going to start that again. As the manager of Cockshut. I don't want to say that. I'm going to rewrite it. I'm just going to rewrite the sentence. We couldn't come up with a better name for the woods. I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to rewrite it. Okay, that's it. I'm rewriting it. All right, here we go. In this book, John shares what it was like for him to manage the woods his final year.